Today, I'm going to be talking about healthy woods, assessing the health of your woodlands. And, we've got some kind of familiar faces here in this picture. I'm sure you've seen some of these things before. Emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, and here's some trees that have died. And in this particular photo, it's due to the emerald ash borer. But just kind of back to that thing that you all brought up, healthy trees and what can impact those, and how do you know if there's a problem? So today I'm going to be focusing on a few different things. First, what is woodland health? So I mentioned that earlier. You know, it's a tricky term, and so we're going to talk about it a little bit more and kind of some of the challenges there. Talking about characteristics of healthy and unhealthy woodlands. So what are some common signs of good conditions and what are some common signs of bad conditions? Not all inclusive, but just a few. And some of those you've already mentioned. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about woodland health threats. Just a couple of the most important ones around right now to briefly mention those. And then some resources. And after that, I'm going to introduce our new Healthy Woods app. It's a new app that myself and a broad range of other forest health specialists from across the country are working on, with the whole idea being this is an educational tool that can help landowners better understand the health of their woodlands and put them in touch with resources to do something about it if they have problems. So that's my plan for today. If at any point you've got a question, feel free to put it in the chat. I'll stop and check that periodically, and or just unmute yourself and ask. That's great too. So happy to have you here. And this is kind of one of the first rollouts of the new Healthy Woods app. We are looking for feedback. The goal is to make it useful to you all, either as county agents, an educational tool, or as woodland owners as you're going through. We want to hear from you. So what is woodland health? One of the questions I ask a lot is, especially of my students, is when you're walking around in the forest, what about it tells you that it's healthy? And how do you figure that out? Some people who've been working in the field for years, this is something they can just sense right away, and they don't have some checklist. This is all done behind the scenes, maybe not even consciously, but it's a lot trickier to define than you might think. So there are actually dozens, if not hundreds, of definitions of forest health, and they can be really different. So a few examples of those would be the USDA's definition is a condition where biotic and abiotic influences on forests, so things like pests, pollution, silvicultural treatments, or forestry and harvesting, do not threaten management objectives now or in the future. So this definition is really based in management objectives of those woodland owners. So it's healthy as long as it's meeting those. And that's in some ways a good definition because it can be really context dependent. In some cases, it's a little tricky because woodland owners' goals vary widely. So for one, woodland owner might be most interested in timber. Another might just want an old growth forest that's going to support wildlife and biodiversity. And so their various thresholds for what is and isn't healthy may be really different. Trees that have a lot of rot might live for a long time. Are they healthy? That's a tough question, and I think it really depends on what your goals are. On the other side of things, there's this concept that woodland health is really the ability of forests to recover from natural and human-caused stressors. So it's about having this integral system that can withstand challenges as they emerge. So you can see that the concept of woodland health has to do both with human needs and goals, as well as the resilience and vigor of those woodland areas. And then just one more definition to throw it in there, so you get a whole range. This is one from Dr. David Merker at University of Tennessee in his glossary of common forestry terms. And in this one, instead of kind of being these big picture terms like the other one, this one just is a really long list of everything that you could possibly think about. And I think it's really great and it's super comprehensive, but it's also kind of points to some of the problems with defining woodland health. So a generally observed, somewhat subjective condition whereby the forest is evaluated according to its age, growth, diversity, existence or absence of injurious insects, diseases, exotic invasive pests, wildlife attributes, aesthetics, degree of resiliency, all of which are weighed against the land management goals. So that's a lot, right? In general, I'd say that we call woodlands healthy when they are resilient and thriving and they're meeting our goals. They're doing what we want as woodland owners. You know, these are your woodlands. They need to be meeting your objectives. So kind of weighing those two different things. So given that, what are some characteristics of healthy woodlands? You all mentioned some of those. Does anyone want to mention some more in the chat? What comes to mind for you when you think of a healthy woodland? Characteristics or qualities? I've got a list of things that I think of, but good canopies, yeah. So right, the trees are core to that woodland. So what's going on with the trees? They have good canopies. Good canopies. It's really hard, you know. Trees aren't like us. We can't just ask them if they're healthy, right? And so it can be hard to know what's going on with trees. But if they have a full canopy that doesn't have a lot of dieback, that's a sign that things are in good health for sure. Anything else that comes to mind? Well, I'll give you some of the things that I was thinking about. So, good stand structure, wildlife, another one. Now, that's great. And that's not on my list either. So, good stand structure. So, someone mentioned, you know, you want to have young trees, you want to have old trees, you want to have a diverse range of different things. And again, that gets into kind of a tricky zone depending on your management goals. But in our naturally regenerating forests, the ones that we have in this area, we want to have not just kind of really mature trees, but we want to have regeneration, younger trees, seedlings, saplings that are they're able to take their place if they die. And we want to have that natural regeneration. We want to see that process happening. We want to have potential for regeneration. So if you have a whole bunch of mature trees, you know, they're big, they're dominant, they're great. That's really wonderful and fun to be in a forest like that. But if you don't have regeneration, if you don't have a seed bank, if you don't have seedlings that are coming up, if you don't have trees that can fill the gaps as some of those trees die, it can be a problem, especially if maybe you have regeneration, but not the kind that you want. Healthy canopies. So Catherine mentioned that healthy trees, healthy canopies typically equal healthy trees. So thinking about that, and then vigorous native species. So it's not always going to be possible to have no non-native and no invasive species. We are overrun with them, but at least they're not an impediment to the success of the native species that you want to see. So that's a few that come to mind immediately for me. There are many, many more, so not at all comprehensive. But then the kind of flip side, what are some characteristics of unhealthy woodlands? In a lot of cases, it's going to be the opposite. You know, you have poor stand structure, little regeneration potential, high tree mortality. It's totally normal to see a dead tree here or there in the woods, a snag. You know, in some ways, that's a good thing. It's good for wildlife. It shows that you've got things changing. You've got opportunity for new species coming in. And in our naturally regenerating forests, you're not going to find areas that don't have a dead tree here or there. But once that level gets abnormally high, it's a cause for concern and kind of a red flag to me. Abundant invasive. So if you've got lots of different invasive plants or insects and diseases, then that can really impact things. And then canopy openings, going back to that idea of we need healthy trees if we want to have a healthy woodland. And, our forests, our woodlands like to grow in that closed canopy setting. And if you've got big canopy openings in a forest with large trees, it could be a red flag that you have something that's causing those. Alternatively, it could be legacy from past management. So something to consider there. So here we go. I've got a few pop quiz questions for you all. Is this woodland healthy? What do we think? I should have made a poll on this, but what do you think about this? Any thoughts? I'll pull up the chat window so I can see. What's going on here? Any guesses? Now, we've seen plenty of this in our state, regrettably, in the recent past. This is not an uncommon sight due to a new invasive insect arrival that we have. Woolly adelgid, it could be, and I'll give you a hint, these were not hemlock, but a deciduous tree, so a tree that loses its leaves in the wintertime. What you're seeing in this picture are ash trees that were killed by the emerald ash borer. So you can kind of look out in this woodland, and not every single tree is killed, but this was a woodland that had a really high percentage of ash, and that's huge. That's a major loss to that landowner, to that woodland. Just a huge change. Pretty much any parameter you can think of, no matter how you define woodland health. If you're interested in timber, that's really bad. If you're interested in biodiversity, in the sustainability of that area, maybe in reducing the amount of invasive plants, because once that ash is lost, invasives will proliferate. So in my mind, this is a serious health issue. So that would be emerald ash borer. How about, let's do another one. How about this woodland? What do you think there? Any thoughts, any guesses about what that is? So it looks a little different. Unlike the picture that I showed first, which had, was very selective, the trees that had died. There were trees that were healthy and trees that had died. This one's much more kind of broad across that entire area. Um, any guesses? Forest fire. That's a good guess, and potentially something that could move in. So one of the tricks about this photo is that these trees aren't actually dead. This is summertime, or I think probably late spring, and these trees aren't dead. They have simply been defoliated. So this is a native insect that every few years will have a boom year. Most of the time it's present in small numbers and doesn't really, cause a whole lot of damage. But this is a forest tent caterpillar that every, few years is going to have a really, really large population number. And it's going to look terrible. It's going to completely defoliate trees. However, this is a native insect, and those trees are adapted to this kind of thing because it won't happen every single year. This is going to stress those trees out, but they'll flush another set of leaves, and probably most of them will be fine. It's a stressor, but one that most of our woodlands can cope with. So I want to kind of put those in contrast, because sometimes the things that look really bad might not necessarily have as big of a negative impact. And in this case, that difference being one of those is killing the trees and is fundamentally changing those woodlands. The other one looks terrible, is going to stress those trees, but those trees should be able to recover. Our trees are really resilient. So just kind of despite how bad it looks. Here's another one. Is this woodland healthy? And I get this question from landowners a lot. So you can see here's a dead tree in their woodland. It's got a big hole, maybe something's living in there, but it's hard to find a woodland that doesn't have some dead trees in it. So just the sign of one dead tree or a few dead trees, to me, is not a cause for concern at all. It's when that number, that percentage of them, is escalating, or it's higher than you've seen before or remember. That could be a red flag for something happening that isn't normal. So just a few kind of different things. And then I want to mention that different health considerations exist for different stands and depending on your goals. So we mostly talked about this so far in the context of woodland owner goals. So, someone who just wants diversity and wildlife might be a lot more tolerant of some heart rot of their trees than someone who's really interested in maximizing timber profits. So, kind of thinking about that when you think about health. But I'd also want to kind of transition over to thinking about different types of woodlands because pretty much everything I've been talking about now works really well for one scenario when you have, big dominant trees. But what about other types of woodlands? So what if you just harvested recently or maybe 20 years ago? Your woodlands aren't going to look the same. And what defines health, what the major health threats are going to be really different. So let's talk about that for a minute. So most of what we think of as woodlands, most of our woodlands in the state are what we call saw timber. So what is that? That's areas that are dominated by large trees with trunks that are over 12 inches in diameter. So, big trees, but they're going to be mixed in with smaller trees as well. It's not that there are only large trees because in our forests and our woodlands, we have a mix of different age classes, and that's a good thing. But that you have these dominant large trees. Um, in that scenario, the health and the composition of those dominant trees is key, right? Because they're kind of driving things. So if there are major health problems, if something like emerald ash borer comes in and all of your dominant trees were ash, that's a serious problem. On the other hand, you already have a lot of processes underway. You probably have or you might have a closed canopy that's going to prevent some other problems with invasive species coming in. But if you're starting to see big gaps and dieback in those large dominant trees, it's a red flag that something might be happening. Kind of another important consideration would be the composition of the regeneration that is there and thinking about the future. So everything with woodlands, our timetables are really long because these trees have such a long lifespans. But in thinking about regeneration, what you're really thinking about is what you want for the future. Are these the trees that you want to see 50, 80 years down the road, or you want your grandchildren to see? And this is extremely important in the saw timber class when you're thinking about planning for future disturbances. So as long as you've got those dominant trees in place and thriving, it might not be as central. But if you're planning a harvest, or if you know that some big disturbance is headed your way, like emerald ash borer, or if there is a major ice storm, those are things that become more important, is what kind of regeneration is there to take the place of those large trees when they're gone. I'm going to contrast that with thinking about a different type of stand. So let's say we're talking about what we would term a pole timber stand. So this is going to be mostly medium trees with trunks that are between 3 and 12 inches in diameter. Where do you get this? You get this after you had a harvest, and then you've got your regeneration and it's growing up, and it's kind of growing to a point now where those trees are competing with each other and kind of starting to figure out which trees are going to become those dominant trees down the road. So at this point, one of the key considerations is, are the trees that you want winning? Are they the ones that are going to become the dominant trees in your woodland? Or do you have a bunch of invasive trees that are in there taking their place? Is there some reason why those trees can't do what you want them to do? So kind of one of the issues that come up is maybe those trees are so dense, or maybe the trees that you want some oak, and all that you've got are a lot of other species that are crowding them out and preventing them from growing and becoming the dominant trees. So this is a key window for timber stand improvement for any kind of practices that you want to do to control the future of your woodland. So another contrast would be a recently harvested stand. So it might be something that was really freshly harvested, like this picture in the bottom, really recently, or it might have been harvested a few years ago and everything's starting to grow back. A lot of these will look really messy and really dense as things start to grow in, but mostly either small trees with trunks that are less than 3 inches in diameter, But of course, this can vary a lot because in our area and in a lot of areas, selective harvests or high grading is really common, where you might have recently had a harvest, but they certainly did not take out all of the big trees. They just took those of high value. So it might not necessarily look like either of these pictures. But it could have been logging or maybe another major disturbance that caused a lot of this. But at this stage, some of the most important considerations are: is there regeneration that will become the dominant trees you want to see down the road? Is that happening? And if not, what do you need to do to make sure that it is? So, are there things that are preventing it? Is there deer browse? In some areas, deer populations are so high that this stage, nothing can really get through. Or are there invasive plants that are taking over that need to be managed before the trees that you want will establish? Is there damage to the site or the remaining trees from logging? So this is something to consider, especially if a lot of trees were left. Are those trees going to grow up into the dominant canopy trees you want in the future? Or are these trees going to be trees that are never going to achieve that? And so, kind of taking that time to plan ahead. So, there are a lot of major woodland health threats, but I like to preface this section by saying that here in Kentucky, we have incredible forests. We have incredible woodlands. The diversity of different tree species that we have is astounding compared to a lot of other parts of the country. And that buys us a lot of wiggle room when it comes to woodland health, because a lot of the threats that I'm going to talk about are invasive insects and diseases that come in and target particular trees, particular species. We've had a history of that happening, and it's really been devastating for woodlands across the world. But because we have so much diversity, it gives us a little bit of buffer there. And I think in general, compared to other parts of the country, ours are very healthy, and we'd like to see it stay that way. This is the doom and gloom portion of the presentation, but I just wanted to put that kind of silver lining in there, and that there's a lot that we can do to promote the health of our woodlands. So, what are some of the major health threats? Invasive insects and diseases are at the top of my list because they can kill perfectly healthy trees and have a record of fundamentally changing our forests. So that's emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid. Invasive plants are another. Unlike the invasive insects and diseases that, for the most part, are a problem because they'll kill those dominant trees that we care about, invasive plants are mostly a problem because they get in the way of our native plant species. So it might be something like in this picture here, you can see bush honeysuckle completely filling the understory of this area. You're not going to be seeing seedlings coming up through that, or even our native wildflowers and other plants that we want. It's really changing the nature of those ecosystems and kind of getting in the way of some of our goals there. Yeah, another thing to keep in mind might be the legacy of past management for our area. Sometimes this can come in the form of high grading, where time after time, the high quality trees have been removed, leaving a lot of low quality trees. In this picture here, I'm showing something different, and this is a pine plantation that was planted and should have been thinned, but was not. So what you're left with are really, really dense stands. People refer to this as the stalking, the density of those trees to some extent. And in this case, those trees are so packed in there, and they've grown really big at this point, that the only part of them that has needles is on the very, very tip top. And people might see the stand and think, oh, this is a white pine decline, or there might be some insect and disease issues there. And there certainly could be over time, because those trees are stressed, they don't have access to enough light and space as they need. But what really drove that was a legacy of past management in that area. Another thing that can pop up would be deer browse. Depending on where you live, that could change things. And there are many other issues out there. And I also kind of want to mention, there are lots of things that might negatively affect the health of trees. We've had major droughts and really weird weather these past few years that can also impact overall health by just stressing trees over time. So let's talk a little bit about those insects and diseases. And I'm going to give some examples with our two most, the two insects that have the biggest impact in our state. But in general, invasive species, insects and diseases can kill healthy trees and cause big problems because they do that. So emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly belchid. But historically, these are just the newest arrivals in a long line of invasives that kill our native trees. And by invasive, I mean they're native to somewhere else, they were introduced here, and our trees really don't know how to defend themselves against them. So chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease, butternut canker, and more. And certainly there are more nearby and recent arrivals to add to this list. I also want to mention that native insects and diseases, they are also out there. They can also cause problems for trees, and they might look really bad, but typically these are mostly, they stress trees or are problems for stressed trees. And not that that can't kill trees and become a woodland health issue. If you have a lot of compiling stresses all together, that certainly could be a problem. But many of our native insects and diseases are less likely to drive major shifts in woodland health unless there's something else happening there. And here's a couple photos. Here's an anthracnose on an oak and yellow poplar weevil on a yellow poplar. And these are really common. You might see them. And especially the yellow poplar weevil, the whole canopy will be brown. You'll wonder what's killing my trees. But typically trees bounce back from that. It's not something that's going to kill our trees just across the board. So let's talk emerald ash borer, just a little bit of review. I'm sure you've heard of emerald ash borer before. I bet many of you are dealing with emerald ash borer before, but just as an example of the challenges of invasive insects. So here's the emerald ash borer. It's that green beetle. And what actually kills the trees are its larvae tunneling under the bark and the vascular system of the tree. So the part of the tree that moves around water and nutrients and everything important, that's where the larvae like to live. It's a pretty good place to eat. And they tunnel so much, and then they're cutting off the circulation of the tree and will effectively girdle it, killing that tree. So some signs of emerald ash borer would be dead branches, the thinning canopy or crown of trees. And these are in a landscape setting, but you would see this in the forest as well, and just might be a lot further up that you'd have to see those thinning crowns. Unfortunately, typically by the time people are noticing problems with emerald ash borer or a lot of other things, damage is already pretty extensive, because by the time the tree is losing branches and losing its crown, those larvae have been tunneling under the bark for some time and causing a lot of damage. So you also might see these D-shaped exit holes. Those are holes made by the adult beetles after they've been tunneling through the tree and eating as larvae when they leave that tree. So by the time you're seeing this, again, those larvae have already been in there, causing lots of damage, tunneling all through. And this is a tree with the bark chipped off, so you can see that damage that's there. And right now, I think in a lot of places that have had emerald ash borer for a while, and those trees are pretty advanced in their decline or dead. Woodpeckers flaking off bark, looking for those larvae. Woodpeckers are actually really effective hunters of emerald ash borer larvae. It's simply that there's so many larvae, so they can't quite keep its population in check. Clearly, the emerald ash borer has just moved throughout and killed a lot of trees. But you can have wildlife trying to get at those that cause this feature. People call this ash blonding or other things. That's just a name for that bark coming off. So here's where we are in the state with emerald ash borer. It was first detected in 2009 in northern Kentucky, and has rapidly moved through the northern, central, eastern part of the state. We've had recent positives in several counties in western Kentucky, and it's probably just going to fill that area in. There is less ash in a lot of that area, but there's no reason to suspect that all of those counties would not have the arrival of emerald ash borer soon. So here's a map, and I really like this one because the previous map told you where emerald ash borer is right now. This map shows you where is ash mortality common due to emerald ash borer. So those counties in red and areas in red, those are areas where ash mortality is very common because of emerald ash borer. So pretty much that translates to where has emerald ash borer been there the longest. The counties or areas that are yellow, there's ash decline with mortality. And by decline, I'm meaning things like, oh, those canopies that aren't looking good, the dieback of those branches. It's clear that the problem is there. Things are going to get worse, but it's just starting out. And this is a map from the Kentucky Division of Forestry. They aerially fly the state to try to determine, how bad is this in different areas. So what a lot of people kind of at this point are trying to figure out is, okay, the beetle's here, the trees are dead, and now what? Or maybe they're well on their way to being dead. So then what do you do? And of course, this is a problem in both landscape and woodland settings. And today we're talking about woodlands, so I'm going to stick to that. But there are different approaches, just like you might have a different approach depending on your objectives as a woodland owner. There are different approaches in those two contexts. But for both, the key is laying the foundation for success post-emerald ash borer. We are fortunate, we have a lot of other great tree species besides ash that can take their place when they die. So the emerald ash borer will kill all of our native ash, especially white and green ash. And hopefully scientists will work towards a solution for that, finding a way for trees to better defend themselves and bring those ash back long term. But in the short term, we're going to lose our ash. So then the question is, how do we make sure that what takes their place is what you want? Are tree species that are going to be long-lived, shade trees, great forest species, not invasive plants. So let's talk about this context. So when you're assessing the damage and kind of how to respond, thinking about how much ash is in your woodlands is key. And so again, another part of woodland health is thinking about what do you currently have. So you can see in this photo, this is a rough distribution of ash across the state. There were some places that had a lot of ash. Ash across the state was only about 4% of the trees. But if you lived in northern Kentucky, or maybe right down here, you might have a lot more ash than that, 25, 30, 35% of the trees in your woodland. Your approach to dealing with emerald ash borer is going to be really different depending on that. If you only had 4% of your trees that were ash or less, you might not need to do anything because it's a very normal process in our woodlands for trees to die and other species to take their place through that regeneration that's already present. But if you had a really high percentage of ash, it might require a lot more active management. So another question would be, how far along is the damage by emerald ash borer? Here you can see some firewood that's being sold with a lot of damage. And in this photo right here, it was some wood that had been killed by ash that had been killed by the emerald ash borer, but harvested and processed. But what is here is the emerald ash borer really only impacts right under the bark. The rest of the wood is good. But as soon as those trees die, they become susceptible to all sorts of other insects and fungi. So you've got damage from little ambrosia beetles that were tunneling all through that wood. And that's important both from the perspective of, a risk to you, how fast are those trees falling apart, but also when thinking about, can you get ahead of this and maybe log your ash to try to make some money to let you do some of those management practices that'll help your woodlands transition and recover to something good down the road. And markets are also going to be important in that. So I'd recommend working with the forester. But if your trees are already dead, it's too late for thinking about that. You might be able to use them for firewood, but it's going to be past the point when you can think about logging them for other purposes. So again, we're talking about laying the foundation for woods post-DAB. So considering a harvest offsets the costs of some timber stand improvement practices. Managing invasive plants is key because what you want to see are our native trees taking their place. You don't want to see a sea of bush honeysuckle taking the place of ash because those are not the same. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what we see here in central Kentucky. So getting ahead of that, managing those plants before they take over. And then dealing with hazard trees. So this is a site I visited. You can see in the photo a little bit, but this site had a pretty high percentage of ash trees, and it's right next to a trail where people walk regularly. And everything that I've circled is a tree that has already failed, an ash tree that has already failed. There was a storm, and many of them did. Fortunately, no one was injured. And then we've got a whole bunch that's ready to go. So thinking about dealing with hazard trees, consider logging before trees start falling apart, because otherwise it's a major safety issue. And they're very low value. Ash trees fall apart really fast, and those snags can be valuable for wildlife, but be super cautious, especially when it's windy. And I recommend working with a professional, a forester. So moving on, I want to talk a little bit about hemlock woolly adelgid, since that's our other invasive insect that's really hurting the health of our woodlands. So hemlock woolly adelgid is a specialist on hemlock trees. So you're not going to find it throughout the state, but it's a major issue for hemlocks and is killing them at high rates and rapid numbers. And right now, right this time of year, if you look, you can see the insects on the underside here, and this kind of woolly, it gives it its name, the woolly adelgid, the woolly masses that they make on the undersides of those needles. So here's a map of where the hemlock woolly adelgid is compared to the range of hemlock, and you can see that at least for our state, it is almost all through that range. So it's a serious issue for all of our hemlocks. And why is that important? Hemlocks might not be a major timber species, but they are critical for those forest ecosystems, especially if we think about where do hemlocks occur. They tend to occur in mountainous areas where you're going to have them along these streams, along these sensitive habitats for amphibians, for water quality, for other things. So the loss of those trees, not only is the loss of those trees, but the fundamental changing of those systems. So there's sporadic mortality across the range. In some areas, it's really high. There are insecticide treatment options out there, and there is research being done looking at predatory beetles to control this insect long term. But in the short term, we're likely to lose a lot of our hemlocks. So, one of those research projects is looking for trees that are somehow resistant to either hemlock woolly adelgid or the emerald ash borer. And if you see them, I want to know. So we've got an app, Tree Snap, to try to connect to scientists that are looking for those resistant trees in areas where all of the other trees have died, not in areas that this has just arrived, but in areas where everything else has been killed by emerald ash borer, everything else has been killed by hemlock woolly adelgid. If there are trees that are still surviving, those are good candidates for looking for some genetic resistance. And at least with ash, there's some research has been found that there are some trees that appear to be somewhat resistant to emerald ash borer. Very, very few numbers of them, just a handful, but that could be key to the long-term reintroduction of ash. So unfortunately, it's not just emerald ash borer, it's not just hemlock woolly adelgid. There are lots of other invasive insects and diseases out there. We just had a new detection of one this past summer, laurel wilt disease of sassafras, and it kills sassafras and spicebush. Neither sassafras and spicebush tend to be dominant trees in our forest. So on the bright side, this is not another emerald ash borer that's going to really wipe out large percentages of the dominant trees. The negative side is that this is just another invasive issue that's, impacting the diversity, the resilience of our woodlands. So sassafras might not be a key dominant species, but it's still important and it still plays a vital role. So thinking about that buffer again, one of the things that makes our woodlands so healthy and so vibrant is that diversity. And the more things that come in that take that away, the worse long term. So here's where it is right now. You can see just in southwestern Kentucky as well as in Tennessee. In Tennessee, they've also detected it in the eastern part of the state. So something that I'm concerned about would be that this is actually spread much further than we know, and we're just starting to get a grip on that. So it's a fungus carried by a tiny beetle. They're both invasive from Asia. And I'm going to show you a few pictures of just what they look like, because I'd love for you to be having your eyes peeled for that. So Right now, this time of year, what you'd look for would be early fall leaf color. So it looks like it's fall for sassafras, and sassafras is beautiful fall color. So those reds and oranges. But really, what that is the tree is does not getting enough water. It's a wilt. So that fungus is in the vascular system of the tree. It's cutting off the circulation, and it'll eventually kill those trees. So you can see the early fall leaf color here. You can see some dead trees here. And if you were to cut into the bark of that tree, just past that bark, you'd see this really distinctive black staining. And that's the fungus living in that vascular system. And here you can kind of see it just under that bark around the edge. That's damaging the tree. So it's spread to tree by these very, very small red band ambrosia beetles. But they are tiny. And when I say tiny, I mean tiny. So here's the size of the hole compared to my thumb there, as well as you can see that black staining again. They are very easy to miss, and is going to make it an extra challenge for when you're thinking about the movement of firewood and trying to stop this thing from moving. It's going to be hard to notice anything like that. So this is one of the reasons why I just recommend don't move firewood long distances, even if it looks okay, because you might not be able to tell what's secretly hiding in it. And I also want to mention there are many different similar issues that can impact sassafras, and lots of things stress sassafras. So this is not the only one. If you see this, bring it to your cooperative extension office or bring it to the plant diagnostic lab. But it might be other ambrosia beetles that could cause this. So it's not the only thing. And of course, we have a whole slew of other invasive insects that are around, not in our state yet, but nearby, that could cause major forest health issues. We have the spotted lanternfly. We have gypsy moth, which loves oak trees, and that would be really, really bad for us. We have sudden oak death, another oak issue. Now it's on the West Coast and not in our area. And we have Asian longhorn beetle, which is just in southern Ohio and is a specialist. It's a generalist, but it loves maples and will rapidly kill them. So we have a lot of threats that are out there and a lot of different issues. But I do think, the future is bright. We also have lots of invasive plants. I'm not going to go into great detail on these, just to mention, they're non-native. They rapidly expand in range, and they can be a big problem in woodlands not because they're killing those trees necessarily, but because they're preventing that regeneration that we want to see. They're preventing key processes that we want to see, and they're reducing the diversity because they're taking the place of our diverse plants, whether they're trees or shrubs or herbaceous species, and just becoming really dominant monocultures. So they tend to have characteristics like high reproduction, fast growing, nothing wants to eat them or kill them. Maybe they produce tons and tons of berries that birds eat and are rapidly dispersed all over. They can tolerate a really wide range of habitats, so they're not going to be specialized for one particular area. And then some of them actually change the environment to their benefit. So they can change the soil in ways that promote it instead of our native plants. So just to run through a few that you're probably familiar with, in our state, we have a Paulownia or princess tree. We have tree of heaven. Tree of heaven can be a major issue, especially if you're looking at a logging operation or some disturbance. If that comes in down the road and takes the place of the trees you want to be seen, it can be a problem. We have mimosa. For shrubs, there are so many different ones, and all of them are doing effectively the same thing. They're all kind of in the understory, taking up space that should be filled by our native species. Multiflora rose, autumn olive, bush honeysuckle, and privet. Vines, now these can grow over trees and impact their ability to photosynthesize and grow, and can be a problem, especially as trees are starting to establish, so maybe in that pole size that we talked about. But they can also just carpet the ground and prevent that regeneration from happening. So we all know kudzu. Winter creeper is really problematic in northern and central Kentucky. Japanese honeysuckle is throughout the state a major issue. Sweet autumn clematis, increasing. I put it on here not because it's as bad as the other two, but because I've seen a lot more of it. It's a popular garden plant, but it certainly does not stay there. And then oriental bittersweet. Now, this is one of the few ones that actually can hurt the trees that it's growing on. That vine can twist around them so strongly that it'll impact those species. And lots of different grasses and herbaceous species, miscanthus, Japanese stilt grass, you name it. And there's doesn't stop there. There are lots of other invasive plants to watch for. So as if we didn't have enough invasive plants out there. And all of these are species that I would say for those who want to leave nature to itself or don't want to get in the way of natural processes. Unfortunately, we've already done that with the introduction of invasive plants, and there's really no turning back the clock on that, especially at some of those key points after a harvest, after a major disturbance, after emerald ash borer killing a large percentage of your canopy. It is very important to manage those invasives. Otherwise, they'll take over and do things that you don't want in your woodland. So there are a lot of great forest health resources out there. I don't have to tell you all because I know on this call we have a lot of county agents that, the county extension offices and agents across the state are by far the best resource for woodland owners to connect with, to get more resources from, to learn about opportunities, and to learn about good contacts for next steps. What are the problems in the areas, what they can do about it. There are extension specialists here at UK. Myself, I'm focused on forest health. Billy Thomas, who largely deals with woodland owners. Jonathan Larson in entomology, and Bill Fountain in arboriculture. Now it's more of the tree health side of things, but still that connection there. The State Division of Forestry, Kentucky Division of Forestry, and their service foresters are a fantastic resource. So this is a photo of Alexandra Blevins. She's the forest health specialist for the state, and I know she's always out throughout the state looking at different issues, making site visits, trying to get a grasp of what's happening on the ground right now. So she's a great resource. Consulting foresters, technical service providers, NRCS. These are really good resources for actually doing something about the problems that are there. So if you want to be removing all of those invasive plants but you don't want to do it yourself, technical service providers. If you're looking for funds to support some of the work that you're doing, NRCS can be a great resource. So I just wanted to put those out there. And then one other resource that I hope will be beneficial to you and others is our new Healthy Woods app. So the whole goal of this app is learning about health issues in your woodlands. It's not going to be a one-stop shop or do everything for you, but more of an educational tool to get you started. We hope that the app will help identify potential problems and point you to professionals and resources for next steps in your management. So this was funded by a grant from the USDA, and it's been a real delight because myself and Jeff Stringer have been kind of the two technical content leads on it. And Jeff Stringer is the chair of our forestry department here at the University of Kentucky, and previously the silviculture extension specialist here in the state. Working with Meg Staten and Abdullah Saeed, who are at the University of Tennessee, and they're on the web and app development side of things. So making an app that's user-friendly and will be maintained into the foreseeable future. And just really connects you to what you need. We've been working with this fantastic group of forestry extension specialists from across the Eastern Hardwoods region, from Maryland, New York, Ohio, South Carolina, and Georgia, to try to make something that'll be useful for woodland owners throughout that area, which is a trick because there's a lot of differences between our areas, but we also have a lot in common. And then Megan Bueland has been working with me to pull together all of our ideas into something that we can share with you. So when and where should you use this app? First, this app is specifically for the upland hardwood context. That's no problem for us in Kentucky because that's the vast majority of our forests, but this doesn't apply for pine plantations or for bottomlands that are really wet areas. When you use it, you want to either find or think about a stand that's an area representative of part of your woodland. You can repeat this as many times as you want for different areas or at different points in time to kind of see how things are changing. And then again, the primary goal is educational, but it will give you a report that you can save and use or share with professionals down the road. And for the agents on the line, I'm hoping that that report could be a good starting place. If a woodland owner approaches you with some questions about this, they could complete that and then share this report, and you'd have kind of a quick rundown of what are some of the issues and potential challenges there that might save some of the kind of back and forth trying to identify those things. So how do we use the app? I'm going to give you a quick demonstration of this. So I've got it open on my phone, and you can see the first thing it wants me to do is a new assessment. And it's asking me, what's the type of woodland that you have? Again, those same kind of new harvest, sapling or pole timber or saw timber stand that we discussed earlier. So I'm going to pick saw timber because it's the most common type of woodland in our state. And once you do that, you can start the assessment. The first question we have is, did you recently experience major weather event? Because if you did, you probably need professional assistance, and it could be an unsafe environment to be spending time in. So we provide some educational information there, as well as encourage woodland owners that if that's the case, they get some professional assistance. Then we ask them, what's their main objective for their woodland? What do they hope to get out of it? And then right back to your comment earlier, what's one of the most important things? Canopies. So look up at the trees around you. Is the canopy open or is it closed? And if it's closed, that's how our forests tend to be when they're in good condition. But if it's open, to me, that would indicate either something about the past use of that area. Maybe there was a harvest, or you've got some trees that were dying or some decline there. You can take photos of it to put them in your report. We ask about dieback. Are you seeing trees that show signs that they're stressed, something that's stressing them out, creating that decline over time? And at each one of these steps, we try to put some educational information in there too. Do you see many dead trees in your stand? Some dead trees is fine, but a lot would be a cause for concern. And then do you see any of these issues on a large proportion of your tree? Now, it's very common to have a few, trees that have these problems. Who hasn't seen sap sucker damage on trees in their yard as well as in their woods? And mushrooms are all over, of course. But if you have a lot of these throughout your woodlands, it could be a sign for concern, a sign that maybe the past management or something that's happening right now is impacting the health of your woodlands. And kind of going through just different things that are happening, different potential issues that are out there that I know you have questions about or receive questions about all the time. Then we ask about the species that are present, the dominant tree species, just to help you keep track of what's going on in your woodlands, as well as to set this contrast between what are the species that are dominant and then what are the species that are regenerating, and is that what you want to be seeing? We also have this glossary in there, so if we use any terms that you're not familiar with, you can look them up right there. Throughout, we have the option to take photos or upload photos if you want. And then we enter into some questions about invasive species. So do you have vines that might inhibit the regeneration you want to be seeing in your woodlands? And if so, which species do you have? We only included a limited number of species here because we didn't want to exhaust people completing this app with every possibility, but just a few different options. And then, of course, the ability to take a photo as well. Do you have any invasive other species in your woodlands? Trees, this could be a major problem. And our whole goal with this really, it's educational, so to make you aware of some of the trees that might be problems in the future, but also starting to look for those invasives in your woodland. Because I think a lot of people, when they get started, they know that they want to have a healthy woodland, but what are the components of that? And so this app really just tries to walk through, when you think about what is healthy and what you'd be looking for, this is just kind of a convenient checklist for that. So this keeps going, and a little bit more about invasive species, deer browse, things like that. But at the end, what you get is a full report. So you can visit that in the app, or you can go to the website, and I'll just show you on the website how you would see that. You can see this report. In this case, our stand got a yellow rating. because we said that we might have invasive species. And you can see summaries, the photos that were included, a little bit of text response, giving some feedback on that. And then you can save that report as a PDF, email it to whoever you want, or just save it for your records. And in that report, you not only have your responses, but you have a little bit of information here giving you some tips based on those. So in this case, one of the questions was, are you planning a harvest soon? And the response being that if you are, working with a forester can give you something that you're much happier with in the long term, both in terms of the health of your woodland as well as the profit that you get. So kind of trying to steer people towards good options throughout. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing, and I know that we're almost to our time, but I wanna see what questions you all have. And I just wanna thank all of you for joining me today. In my plans, this was going to be an in-person webinar that we'd have and try out this app. And of course, you know, this year is not one for planning. So I appreciate you joining me today and talking a little bit about Woodland Health and our new app. And if you're interested in learning more, you can email me. You can follow our Facebook group, KY Forest Health, or check out our website. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and invite you all to have any questions, or maybe even things that I didn't talk about today, but things that you've noticed in your woods or you've been getting questions about.